The Bible is one of the world's most famous and revered books. But is this book holy as many people claim? Were its writers really inspired of God? What do scholars have to say about the historicity of the events recorded in the Bible? Join me, Chaka as I take a deep dive into this most fascinating book. This is the unHoly Bible Project. Hello everyone, welcome to the Anthony Morris Returns channel and welcome to the very first episode of the unHoly Bible Project. Now the first thing I just want to say is that the title might be a bit misleading, the unHoly Bible. This is not meant in any way to be sacrilegious, and actually this show is meant to be cater for people from all walks of life, so people who have an interest in the Bible because they have a faith, maybe they're Christian, maybe they're Jewish, or some other faith that subscribes to the whole Bible or part of the Bible, as in the case of people who are of a Jewish tradition who would subscribe to the Hebrew Bible. But it's also a resource for people who just have an interest in the Bible for whatever reason, maybe for academic reasons or for just broadening their knowledge. So the purpose of this show is not to bash the Bible in any way or to be very pejorative towards the Bible in any way, shape, or form. This is actually purely you could say, kind of like an academic look at the Bible. And the reason why I've called it the unHoly Bible Project is because I will be looking at the Bible not as a holy or a religious book. I would be looking at it as a work of literature, and I will be treating it as I would treat any other type of literature. So for example, if somebody was reading Shakespeare, so I'll be reading the Bible as if I was reading a piece of work like Shakespeare, and this is the reason why I've called it the unHoly Bible Project. And you notice I also call it a project because this is probably going to be a very long project that might span several years. So my idea with this project is that I'm going to go through the Bible kind of forensically from the beginning, from Genesis chapter 1 and hopefully to the end of Revelation chapter 22. And what I'm going to be doing essentially is I will be reading the Bible through the lens of what scholars have had to say about the Bible. Now, I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm not claiming to be a Bible scholar. I don't even intend to be a Bible scholar at any point. I'm just somebody who has an interest in the Bible just because of my religious upbringing. And I no longer believe in the Bible as the inerrant word of God, as an inspired book. I just look at it as a piece of literature, but I think that it is still a very fascinating book, and I think that it is a very sophisticated book, which you can people actually spend their entire lifetime just studying maybe just a part of the Bible. So you've got New Testament scholars, you've got Hebrew Bible scholars, and so on, and some people just dedicate their lives studying a section of it. The reason why I have decided to come up with this series was when I started digging deeper into the Bible and started sort of questioning things that I just accepted initially as things that were inspired by God, that were in the Bible for some reason. I found a lot of very useful resources. I found a lot of free resources. One of the resources that was very, very helpful for me was the open-year courses. So when you go on oyc.yale.edu, I'm going to put that in the description. They have two fascinating courses. So they have an introduction to the Hebrew Bible by Christine Hayes, and then they've got an introduction to the New Testament by Del Martin. And I found these resources very, very, very helpful, and they opened my mind to a lot of things. They opened my eyes to a lot of things that I had previously not seen in the Bible when I read it. And so that was really, really good. And then there's a few other resources that I looked at. But one difficulty that I encountered, and I would be interested in the comments if anyone has found a resolution to this, was that, yes, there are a lot of resources, but if you just wanted something that went through, something that was easily accessible, that went through the Bible, just like chapter by chapter, or let's say story by story even, it's very difficult to find such a resource. And this is what made me come up with this idea of this unHoly Bible project, where I'm just going to try and put all my findings in one place. Now, this is going to be a long-term project, as I've said, which might span several years, and we'll see where we are. So I'm going to be presenting this in the form of these videos. I will also try and set it up so that it's also available in the form of a podcast, so that people who don't have that ability to sit down and watch a video, they can just listen to that podcast while they're driving or they're doing some other activities. But the idea is I will try to sort of bring what scholars have to say about pretty much every part of the Bible through this project. And also the idea is that if this project gains a lot of traction, in that there's a lot of interest from people, then I will think about writing my findings in a book. Or it's not actually going to be a one book, it's going to be a volume of books. Because what I'm thinking for the first part of this unHoly Bible project is that the book of Genesis itself will compose of volume 1. So I'm hoping to sort of do one episode every week, and then that means that hopefully by the end of this year, 2024, I would have done the whole of Genesis, and that will be volume 1 of the unHoly Bible project. So that's probably what the book is going to look like, where a section of the Bible is covered in one volume of this book, if I eventually end up in a situation where I can actually write a book. So this is the idea. So this is kind of like a neutral place. It's a place for all people who faith, or people who lack faith. Because if you've seen any of the other stuff that I produce on this channel, it's pretty much dedicated to people who have some kind of contact with my former religion. But that's not what I'm going to be doing in this. This is kind of a neutral space for everyone. So I think that that's those are the most important things I needed to mention in terms of an introduction. That's quite a long introduction, but I'll put chapters in here so that people can just skip to the point if that's what they want to do. So I'm just gonna bring up the slides. So that's the title of the whole project, the series. It's called the unHoly Bible Project. I've explained why I've called it that. And this is volume 1, episode 1. And the title is, Did Moses Write the Pentateuch? Now, there's just one thing that I also just need to mention before we get into this discussion in earnest, is that I'm going to be reading the scriptures. When I reference scriptures, I'll mostly be reading them. I will put the scriptures in the slides, the scriptures that I intend to read and reference. I will put them in the slides just to make it easier, so that I'm just not going back and forth looking for the scriptures. And I'm going to be using also a neutral translation of the Bible. I'm going to be using the New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. So it's also referred to as NRSV UE. And this is kind of a widely respected, scholarly produced translation of the Bible. As with any translation, there are a lot of difficulties, and there are lots of reasons why, even with the best interest, scholars cannot produce the perfect Bible. Now, one of the difficulties that the NRSV has is that it uses the word Lord in all capitals, where in the original text, in the original Hebrew, there was the tetragrammaton, YHWH. And I'm just going to demonstrate that very quickly. I'm just going to go a few slides in. So if you go look on slide number 3, there is the scripture there in Exodus 34, verse 1. And if you're reading the New Revised Standard Edition, the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, what you will see here at the beginning is it says the Lord, and Lord is in all capitals. And if you read the preface, it explains that in the original you would have had those 4 letters. Now, this becomes quite difficult when you're explaining some of the theories or some of the findings that researchers have found, if you don't know that actually there was the tetragrammaton in that place. And so I have just taken the liberty of replacing that LORD capitals with what was originally in the text, the YHWH. And a lot of the people who discuss these topics, especially scholars, lecturers, when they do lectures, they do that effectively. So I'm being honest and upfront about it. and it's purely for scholarly and academic purposes that I am making that change. So I hope that is helpful to people. Um, so the what I'm going to be covering in this particular episode is the question of whether Moses wrote the Pentateuch. And by the Pentateuch, I mean the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Numbers and Deuteronomy. That makes up the Pentateuch. And I will be examining the question whether Moses actually wrote that which is a kind of common view among religious people, Christians. I'm not entirely sure whether in the Jewish community that's still a common view. So I'll be examining that question in depth. I just want to give you a bit of an overview of what I will be covering in Volume 1. So as I mentioned, in Volume 1, I will be covering pretty much most of the book of Genesis. So I'm not going to be doing it verse by verse, but I'll be kind of be doing it story by story. So I'll be looking at the main stories in the book of Genesis and looking at what scholars have discovered about these stories. I'm not a scholar, as I've said, but I'm a human being. I have emotions and I have opinions. And so sometimes I will mention my opinion regarding what I think was happening in that story. But I will be doing this on the backbone of what scholars have to say. And I'll also be trying to sort of go with the consensus, the general consensus among scholars. I'll be trying my best to do that. But if I get it wrong, please bear with me because I'm not a Bible scholar and I'm not claiming to be one. So yeah, so in Volume 1, in this episode, I'll be covering the authorship of the Pentateuch. In the next episode, I will cover Genesis chapter 1 and part of Genesis chapter 2. And actually, there are 2 different creation stories in the book of Genesis. So I'll be discussing why scholars have uncovered that there are actually 2 different creation stories in the book of Genesis and what those stories are and what's distinct about the 2 different stories. Then I think there are a couple of stories in between there, but the major story that I'll be covering is the flood account. There are also 2 distinct flood accounts in the book of Genesis, and I will be going through that in Volume 1. I'll talk about the story of the Tower of Babel, and then a huge portion of the Volume 1 will be discussing the patriarchs, so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and a few of the other characters obviously will be covered. But there's so many stories with regards to the patriarchs that I think maybe it would take a couple of dozen episodes to cover all those stories. So I'll try and go through those in a lot of detail. And I've also just highlighted Jacob's deathbed prophecy, which is found in Genesis chapter 49. And I think this is an important thing to consider as a sort of as a standalone item, just because in the deathbed prophecy you have Jacob effectively on his deathbed prophesying that from the tribe of Judah there will be the kingly line, but then the first king of Israel is not from the tribe of Judah. It's Saul. He's from Benjamin, and then he has to be replaced. So that creates a lot of problems, and scholars have looked at certain things when you look at the Bible, the Hebrew Bible as a whole, and then covered things that help us understand that deathbed prophecy. So I'll be going through that. So I'll pretty much be trying to cover most, if not all, of Genesis, but not verse by verse, story by story. So let's maybe get into this question of the authorship of the Pentateuch. So did Moses actually write the Pentateuch? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if he did not write, then who actually wrote these books? And why does this question even arise? Well, if you're just reading the Bible as a person of faith, it's kind of like one of those things that you just take for granted. You just accept that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. What's the problem there? And I think you can find a lot of reasons to support that argument. So I guess maybe one of the most obvious reasons is the fact that we know that Moses, at the very least, he collected the Ten Commandments, which is a very famous part of the Bible. So he goes up the mountain, God gives him these tablets with the 10 Commandments wrote on them, and then he breaks the 10 Commandments. He goes back up the mountain, and now you have Exodus 34 verse 1, where YHWH, Yahweh said to Moses, cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets which you broke. So Moses, they're very much being involved in the writing, at least of the Ten Commandments. And actually, if you look on the slide below, there are other verses which you can have a look at. And I'm not going to go into those verses in detail, but those verses talk about Moses writing, Moses being instructed to write a particular aspect of the law that God was giving to the Israelites, Moses being instructed to write a document. So there are references in the actual Pentateuch of Moses writing at least portions of what has now become part of the Pentateuch. So I guess that's an argument that people can use to support the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. There are also some extra Pentateuch sources that point to the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. And by extra Pentateuch, I just mean sources outside of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, sources within the Bible that suggest or actually even state that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I've just given you a couple of examples here. So in Ezra 7 verse 6, the first part of Ezra 7 verse 6, it says, "This Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that YHWH, God of Israel, had." So I think I was trying to fix the Lord, and I haven't really done it properly. So I have to correct these slides before I upload them. And the other thing I just need to, I didn't mention at the beginning, is for each of these episodes, I will be putting a link to the slides on the description of the video. So that people can have access to these slides. So what it said there was effectively the Lord, the God of Israel, but it's actually Yahweh, the God of Israel, had given them. So Moses there being, Israel is making the attribution to Moses of having written the law, I think, and thereby the law he's probably referring to the first, at least a good portion of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. So that's Ezra. Jesus, in Matthew 8, verse 4, it says, "Then Jesus said to him, 'See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them.'" So Jesus is making a reference to a law in the Pentateuch that talked about someone who had leprosy. If they were cured from the leprosy, they could go and show themselves to the priest. The priest would examine them and declare them clean, because someone who had leprosy was viewed as unclean. So Jesus is making that reference to the Pentateuch, and he's referencing Moses as the author or as the originator of those laws. And then the Apostle Paul as well makes a similar attribution. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 9, he says, Paul writes, "For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned?" So the law of Moses, again, an attribution of at least a significant part of the Pentateuch originating from Moses. So these are extra Pentateuch sources within the Bible, kind of supporting that argument of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. There are also some extra biblical sources. So now we're moving outside of the Bible itself and just moving to some external literature that support this idea of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. So one of these is Philo of Alexandria. In the works of Philo, he wrote, "Moses says, 'In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.'" Now, this is a very clear attribution to the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis, the very first part of the Pentateuch, as being written by Moses. And he's stating that quite explicitly. Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, quite a famous first century Jewish historian, he writes in Flavius Josephus against Appian that he basically asserts that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch in that view. And that view remained quite standard for, pretty much millennia. in Jewish thought and among Jewish rabbis that Moses was the undisputed author of the Pentateuch. But except there were problems that even rabbis themselves were grappling with this idea of Moses being the author of the Pentateuch. And one of the problems, they are problems which you and I can just identify by without being a scholar, without looking into this history that I am discussing here. One of the problems is we saw what Philo of Alexandria there said. Moses wrote, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and it's not just that. Moses then gives this detailed description of the creation account of how God effectively created the heavens, how he created the earth, how he started creating seas, land, animals, plants here on the earth, and eventually humans. Now, the question is, how did Moses find out things that happened before any human even existed here on the on the planet Earth, if he was the author of the Pentateuch, including Genesis? So that's a question that I personally had, even when I was a believing Christian. I found that a bit confusing, and I didn't really have a good answer or good explanation given to me. In the book of Genesis, particularly, Moses also writes very intricate details about the patriarchs, about Abraham, about Isaac, about Jacob, about Joseph. He even writes about intimate conversations. So, for example, he writes about conversations that Abraham was having with Sarah in their home. He writes about other conversations that they were having with people around them, where it was just two people involved in those conversations. And you find these long dialogues or monologues in the book of Genesis. And you just wonder, how did he record all that information? How did he record it in such a detailed way? Where did he get the information for such long and detailed conversations, intimate conversations? So that's, for me personally, that was a problem, and that, I guess, it could be a problem for a lot of people that are reading the Bible. You have to have some kind of good explanation for that, unless you're just going to go, well, more God taught him, that's what happened. I guess it's very difficult to find a satisfactory explanation. The other question that comes up is, why does Moses never write in the first person? It's understandable if you just take the book of Genesis, that, okay, there's nothing there to do with Moses in the book of Genesis. He doesn't exist at that point. But in the book of Exodus, going from Exodus to Deuteronomy, Moses is very, very involved in pretty much all the action that's happening in those books, but he never writes in the first person. He never says, then I did this, then I went there, then I was asked to do this. He always talks about himself in the third person. He always says, and then Moses was told to do this, and then Moses went and did this, and this is how Moses reacted. The other question that I also had this question, even when I was a kid and reading the Bible, I had this question of, how did Moses write about his own death? So if we're saying he wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, how did he write about his own death? How did he know when he was about to die, when he died, how he was buried, how people mourned his death, and so on? Because he writes, all those things are described in quite some detail in the book of Deuteronomy. So these are kind of obvious problems that I think anyone who's just switches on their brain while reading these things will kind of encounter. So what actually happened? We said that the rabbis pretty much accepted that Moses was the author of the Bible, but even then there was a kind of a debate. So there's this passage I've just referenced, Deuteronomy 34 verses 5 to 12, which talks about the actual death of Moses, and what happened beyond that. And they actually said, well, some of them said, well, Moses had a revelation that he was going to die and this was going to happen, and then so he wrote that. And others said, well, actually, verses 5 to 12 is an appendix to the Pentateuch. So this was written by a companion of Moses. Perhaps Joshua wrote this appendix and then added it to the book of Deuteronomy. So even people who just generally accepted that Moses was the author still found a lot of difficulty with, or at least some difficulty with some aspects of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Then in the 12th century, there came a Spanish philosopher called Abraham ibn Ezra. Now, I know in the slide I've said that he raised some issues with the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Now, I guess this was kind of some kind of internal or even, well, external dialogue, maybe with himself and trying to get others involved in the dialogue, because Abraham ibn Ezra insisted right up to, as far as I know, right up to his very death, that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch. Now, what he did was he had uncovered some kind of difficulties, you could say, with this theory when in his own reading of the Pentateuch. And what he did is he started kind of raising these in kind of um, indirect way. So he was sort of like using riddles to kind of raise these questions. And I've highlighted some of the verses that he discovered that actually were quite difficult if you were to accept that Moses wrote the whole Pentateuch. So one of them was Deuteronomy 1 verse 1. And there it says, these are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness, on the plain opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Di-Zahab. And the problem with this verse is that Moses is seen as speaking on the other side of the Jordan, not the side of the Jordan where the Israelites were when they settled in the Promised Land. Because if you remember, the Israelites had to cross the Jordan River to go and settle in the Promised Land. Now, whoever the author is of the book of Deuteronomy, he seems to be on the other side of the Jordan River, where the Israelites have settled. And he's writing from his perspective and saying, well, before we cross the Jordan, before the Israelites, the nation crossed the Jordan, Moses spoke these words. So that's what he's saying here, beyond the Jordan. So this actually raises the question. So if Moses never crossed the Jordan, as we are told in the Bible very, very explicitly, how is he then writing from a perspective of somebody who has crossed the Jordan and into the Promised Land, or into the side where the Promised Land is? So that's one of the issues Abraham bin Ezra noticed. He noticed a few other issues. So in Genesis, so he noticed what I will call anachronisms. Now, for those people who are not familiar with what an anachronism is when an idea from a later time is imposed onto an event that is supposed to have happened in an earlier time. And you find a lot of anachronisms in the Bible, and actually during this series, we're going to be talking about these anachronisms and identifying them. And just to kind of illustrate what is meant by an anachronism is, imagine if you were reading a, let's say, novel or a spy thriller or anything like that, that was set in the 70s or the 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever. And imagine that in that story, they started talking about a smartphone. So this is set in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, and they're talking about a smartphone. That would be an anachronism, because smartphones did not exist. There wasn't even the idea of smartphones in that era. And this happens quite a lot in the Bible. And this anachronism was noticed by Abraham bin Ezra in Genesis 12, verse 6, where it says, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. So at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. So that's an important thing to notice, because whoever this author is, he's clearly talking about a time when the Canaanites no longer live in the land in which the story is being written. Because why would he say at that time the Canaanites were in the land if the Canaanites are no longer in the land, because the Israelites have pushed the Canaanites out of the land? So this seems to be a later story from a time when the Israelites are settled in the Promised Land. The next one is Genesis 2:22, verse 14. It says, so Abraham called the place. I should have actually corrected this, and I'll correct it before I upload the slides. It says the place it will say Yahweh will provide, as it is said to this day, on this mount of the Lord, on this mount of Yahweh, it shall be provided. So here, this scripture is making a reference to Mount Moriah. Now, what we know now is Mount Moriah was located in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, so the Mount Moriah, that was the Temple Mount. That's where the temple was eventually constructed in Jerusalem. Now, the story here is saying that that during this time in which the writer is writing, when people go to Mount Moriah to offer the sacrifices, they say, on the mount of the Lord, on the mount of Yahweh, it shall be provided, when they go to offer sacrifices. So this is clearly talking about a time when Jerusalem is an Israelite city. There is some worship going on there in Jerusalem, and on this mountain, Mount Moriah. There's probably a temple at Mount Moriah. This is when this story is likely being written. So how could Moses have known years in advance that there would be the occupation of Jerusalem, that Jerusalem would be the Temple Mount would be used for worship, a temple will be constructed there? So this author is definitely writing from that perspective of a temple, more very likely existing on Mount Moriah. So how could it be Moses if that is the situation? Because he says it to this day. From the author's perspective, that situation already exists, a situation which never existed in Moses's time. So I'm just going to go over that again, because sometimes when you're watching lectures by scholars, they go over this very quickly, and I want this to be as accessible as possible for people. So basically, the writer of Genesis 22, verse 14, lives at a time when the Israelites have occupied Jerusalem. The Israelites use Mount Moriah for some form of worship. Very likely the temple already exists at Mount Moriah and sacrifices are offered there. And that's why this author says, as it is said to this day, the time the author is writing, on the mount of the Lord, on the mount of Yahweh, it shall be provided. So it is very difficult to say that that was Moses. In fact, I think it's impossible to say that that was Moses writing, because during Moses' lifetime, the Israelites never occupied Jerusalem. They never had any worship on Mount Moriah. So the next one that Ibn Ezra identified, the next tricky verse that he identified, is Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. It says there, now only King Og of Bashan was left of the remnant of Rephaim. In fact, his bed, an iron bed, can still be seen in Rabbah of the Ammonites. By the common cubit, it is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Now, I've added all the italics you see in the scriptures are mine. So this author, again, is writing from their perspective, where they're saying this thing can still be seen. This bed can still be seen. Now, this battle that is spoken about here was waged in the 40th year of the trek of the Israelites. Now, we also know that Moses did not survive the whole 40 years or beyond the 40-year trek of the Israelites in the wilderness, because he was told he was not going to enter the promised land, and he died. Now, this author is saying at the point that he's writing, this bed has now moved to the city of Rabbah in Ammon. Now, there is a very interesting comparison that you can make with Deuteronomy 2, verse 37. So in Moses' lifetime, Moses is saying that the Israelites were forbidden from going into the land of Ammon. Now, if Moses was the author of this verse, you have to think about the fact that sufficient time had passed from the time that this war happened to the time that this bed ended up into an Ammonite city, the city of Rabbah. And also sufficient time had passed such that the Israelites were either ignoring this command or not really applying this command to enter this city of Rabbah of the Ammonites. So, so how could Moses be the author of this? Because the fact that the author actually says can still be seen seems to suggest that quite a good amount of time has passed since this battle took place. So again, this really raises the question as to whether, at least I think you can very safely say that with these verses that we've looked at, that Ibn Ezra identified Moses clearly could not have been the author of those verses. So let's just go over them very quickly. So we've got Deuteronomy 1 verse 1, the idea of the author being beyond the Jordan, or on the side of the Jordan where the Israelites ended up occupying. And Moses, we know, never crossed the Jordan, so he couldn't have written this verse. The author writing about a time when the Canaanites were in the land. We know that Moses never experienced the elimination of the Canaanites from the promised land. So again, couldn't have been Moses. And then this Genesis 22 verse 14 is a reference to the Temple Mount being used for worship in Jerusalem, and something Moses never experienced in his lifetime. And then there's this reference of the iron bed that ended up in an Ammonite city still being in existence, very likely quite a significant amount of time after that battle, for it to be kind of a surprise or kind of an interesting fact that actually that bed is still there. It means that some sufficient time had passed, and this idea of the Israelites not being allowed to enter Ammon not being such a big issue. So these are the things that Ibn Ezra identified. Now, he was writing in a way where he was just saying, well, think about this. He wasn't really categorically saying Moses was not the author of the Pentateuch. He was writing in a kind of roundabout way, so to speak, because obviously at that time it was probably quite an issue to just stand up and start questioning something so widely accepted as the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Now, there's just one more verse. Now, this is an extra verse. I don't think Ibn Ezra identified this one. I'm not very sure, but this is another verse where we have an anachronism. So I've gone over what an anachronism is. I'm not going to repeat that. But it says, Genesis 36 verse 21 says, these are the kings who reigned. Sorry, apologies for that. It says, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. So now again, if we're saying that Moses wrote Genesis, how come he's talking about a time? He's talking from a point of view of a time when there are kings in Israel, because you only say before any kings reigned over Israel, meaning that you have now experienced a time. You're either experiencing a time when the kings are ruling over Israel, or you're experiencing a time beyond the time when the kings ruled over Israel. But this author clearly has experienced this. Moses never experienced any of that. He never experienced a king ruling over Israel. He never experienced a time when he could say, oh, in the past, the Israelites used to have a king. He never experienced that. So, but this author has experienced that, and that clearly cannot be Moses. So what happened next? So there came a man called Benedict de Spinoza in the 17th century. Also called Baruch Spinoza, Baruch. I will add that to the slide. So he uncovered more problems with the theory of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. And he was quite radical in his views, and he was very categorical about it. So, for example, he said that the idea that Moses wrote the Pentateuch was ungrounded and even irrational. And he pointed to a number of additional verses in addition to the ones that Ibn Ezra had identified. For example, Numbers 12 verse 3, it says, and now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. Now, a lot of translations, including the translation I grew up with in the religion I grew up with, said that Moses was by far the meekest of all the men on the earth. So that's maybe a rendering that you'll be more familiar with. Now, the question that arises is, and I actually also used to have this question before I sort of delved into Bible scholarship. How is Moses basically claiming to be humble and at the same time saying he's by far more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth? So either Moses has a very high self-esteem, or more likely it's not Moses that is writing this, it's somebody else that is characterizing Moses from a third person point of view. Another verse that he identified is Deuteronomy 34 verse 10, which says, never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Now, this is a comparison. Moses is being compared to all the other prophets. Now, you just wonder, in what period is this? Is this in the period of the judges? Is this in the period of the when the prophets were very active during the times of the kings, when this comparison is being made, or is it maybe at some point towards the end of the writing of the Hebrew Bible? So clearly, there has to have been a period when there has been extensive activity of prophets for this comparison to be made, for this comparison to make any sense. If you were just going to take the lifetime of Moses, Moses was effectively the only, or at least the main prophet during his entire lifetime. So this is not an effective comparison. So for the comparison to work, there has to have been a period of significant activity of many great prophets. And that's when the comparison is being made. So this clearly could not have been written by Moses either. And then you've got Genesis 14, verse 14. It says, when Abraham heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, the city of Dan did not exist during the time of Moses. Why? Because the Israelites were in the wilderness. This territory of Dan was only given to this tribe during, I think it was in the latter part of Joshua's time, or going into the period of the judges. It didn't exist in Moses's time. So again, another example of an anachronism if you were to take Moses as the author. So, what conclusions did Spinoza come to once he found all those issues? So Spinoza states it is clearer. So it is are my words, but his words are clearer than the sun at noonday, that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses, but by someone who lived long after Moses. And Spinoza went on to conclude that Moses only wrote limited portions of the Pentateuch. He suspected that Ezra was probably the author or compiler of the full history that we find in the Pentateuch. And these were kind of radical views in the 17th century, when there was still this reverence to the idea of Moses being the author of the Pentateuch. So what eventually happened to Spinoza was he was eventually excommunicated from the Catholic Church for being so vocal and having such radical views. But this was really kind of the beginning of this critical reading of the Pentateuch. Then we have another scholar who played quite a very, very significant role. So his name was Jean Astruc. So those of you that speak French, maybe please help me with my pronunciation. And he wasn't, like, his day job was not being a Bible scholar, but he was somebody who was clearly interested in Bible and the critical reading of the Bible. And again, just to clarify again another terminology. So when you talk about critical or criticism, it's not bashing the Bible. We're talking about just reading it carefully, identifying problems and trying to resolve those problems and trying to come up with an interpretation that makes sense predominantly from a historical point of view. So when you read the Bible quite carefully, particularly, I think this is more clear in Genesis, you will notice that in some stories, God is just called God. And the Hebrew word for God is Elohim. So if you're reading it in Hebrew, you'll find that in some of the stories, you have God being called Elohim. The other thing you will find is that in other stories, God is called Yahweh. And a clear example of this is in Genesis chapter 4. It states that that people started calling on the name Yahweh in Genesis chapter 4. But then, if you go into Exodus, in Exodus chapter 3, God introduces himself for the first time to Moses as Yahweh. And he says, I've not been known by this name until now. And then in Exodus chapter 6, he introduces himself again as Yahweh. So this is something that was noticed by Astruc. And the other thing that you will notice also in the when you read the Genesis and the whole Pentateuch, but Genesis in particular, you will notice that some stories repeat themselves. So we have what we call doublets, where one story same story is told twice, and sometimes some of the minor details are changed, but you can tell that it is clearly the same story. You also have what are called triplets, where the story is actually effectively repeated twice. Now, purely, some scholars argue that if for a story to be called a doublet or a triplet, it has to have like elements of the same characteristic, elements of the same key elements that are the same. So it has to involve the same characters. It has to be generally talking about the same thing. Maybe there might be a change in location and something like that, but generally same characters, same thing, same resolution to the story. I kind of take a more nuanced view of what a doublet or a triplet is. So an example that I'm going to give you just is for you to understand what I was building up towards was there is something which I consider to be a triplet in the book of Genesis. So in the book of Genesis, you have the story of Abraham lying about Sarah being his wife, and he does this on two separate occasions. But effectively, he's doing the same thing, and the outcome is effectively the same because he doesn't want Sarah to be taken by another man. But then you also have Isaac doing the same thing with Rebecca. So some scholars say, well, that's not a triplet. It is a doublet in the case of Abraham and Sarah, but you can't say with Isaac, although it's unlikely that the exact same thing happened with Isaac, but you can't really call that a triplet. But I think that's a triplet. I think it's the same story being told 3 times. And this is one of the things that you notice. And this is what made Astruc to start thinking that maybe Moses was using different sources. So Astruc believed, he was a firm believer in the fact that Moses in the idea that Moses had written the Pentateuch. But what he was saying was, well, I think Moses was using different sources. And what Astruc was saying was that Moses actually took all these sources and he tried to be as faithful as he could be to those sources, and he put them in these columns. So Astruc was saying that those stories that use the name God, that call God Elohim in Hebrew, he referred to those as the A stories. And then there were the stories that use the divine name Yahweh. He called those the B stories. So that you have Moses putting these stories in these 2 columns, the A stories and the B stories. And then he said, well, there was a few other fragments that Moses used. And he said there was probably up to 10 fragments. And he says, well, the main fragments among those was the C and the D, but the biggest sources are A and B. And then you've got these other fragments, chief among them are C and D. So this was kind of a good theory. And this was improved upon by let's just move on to the next slide, by a German scholar now. The German scholars now enter into this field. And so a German scholar by the name of Johann Gottfried Eichhorn. So what Eichhorn did was that he ran with that theory, the A-B source theory that Astruc had developed. And here now we're beginning to have what we call source criticism. And again, it's not criticizing who the sources were, but it's just really reading carefully and trying to figure out what sources did the author or the compiler of this work use. So what he did was he kind of renamed, he developed this naming convention. So he looked at those stories that were calling God Yahweh, and he called them the J sources. So the reason why it's J, Yahweh obviously starts with a Y, but the reason why it's J is that in German, the spelling for Yahweh, it starts with a J. So it's Yahweh. You'd pronounce it in English as Yahweh, but I think in German they probably say Yahweh. Uh, and so he called that the J source. And then the source that used Elohim, he called that the E source, so that you have these two sources, J and E, instead of this more arbitrary A B kind of naming convention. So this was quite a good theory, and also on top of that, um, whereas Astruc applied his theory only to the whole of Genesis and the first two chapters of Exodus, Icon applied this theory to the rest of the Pentateuch, in the entirety of the Pentateuch, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. He said there are these two sources that are being used throughout the Pentateuch, the J source and the E source, and they're being combined, and that's why you have doublets and in some cases triplets of stories. And it was quite a satisfactory story. And actually, when I first heard about this theory and I started looking carefully, I thought that's quite a satisfactory explanation of things. But the story doesn't end there. There came another German author. His name was W.M.L. de Vetter. Well, if you're interested in what the initials W.L.M.L. stand for, they stand for Wilhelm Martin Lebrecht, but is generally referred to as W.M.L. de Vetter. Now, W.M.L. de Vetter noticed that there was something unique about the book of Deuteronomy. So he noticed that in the book of Deuteronomy, there's kind of a fresh start. So, in the earlier books, sort of Exodus, Leviticus, Moses really mediates the law between God and the nation of Israel, particularly in the book of Exodus. But De Vetter noticed that this happens again in Deuteronomy, where towards the end of his life, Moses is then mediating the law again and basically making the Israelites get into this covenant once again with God. And the other thing that he noticed was that towards the end of Numbers, the story of Moses really ends. So Moses is told he's going to die. Moses appoints Joshua and so on. And this story effectively ends there. But De Vetter noticed that in Deuteronomy, the story starts afresh. And a lot of the stuff that is in Leviticus and in Numbers is then being repeated in Deuteronomy. And the other thing that he noticed was that the style of writing of Deuteronomy was significantly different from what is in the earlier books of the Pentateuch. And even the theological viewpoint was different. So, for example, in Deuteronomy, you have this strong insistence of a single sanctuary for worship. You have this polemic against multiple places of worship scattered throughout the land that the Israelites occupy. So this was quite new. So De Vetter then came up with a theory that actually Deuteronomy is a separate source in itself. So it's not a J or an E source, or a combination of those sources, but it has to be a separate source on its own. And then he cross-referenced this to the story we have in the book of Kings, 2 Kings 22 and 23, where Josiah starts these reforms in the temple, and then the priests find the book of the law, and then Josiah discovers that actually we're not following the law, and then he starts instituting these reforms. He starts tearing down these places of worship that are scattered throughout the land and insisting on a single place of worship. So De Vetter concluded that the earliest sources must have been written during the time of Josiah, during the time of Josiah's reign. That's towards the end of the monarchic period, and the book of Deuteronomy itself being a separate source. So, and this source was then referred to as the D source, D for Deuteronomy, as a source separate on its own. So at this stage now we have three sources effectively. So we have the J source that uses Yahweh for when it refers to God. You have the E source that uses Elohim when it refers to God, and then you have a separate source, a standalone source, Deuteronomy, the D source. So later on, another scholar, Carl David Ilgen, he suggested that actually there is a third source. So the stories that use Elohim, it is not just one source. There's two sources. And again, this would become apparent the when you read the Pentateuch quite carefully, starting from Genesis. So, for example, in Genesis, you have the first story being, if you just went by the J and the E source theory, you would have that source being assigned to E. But the thing is, that source is quite different from the other E stories that you find in the book of Genesis. So this story is kind of very interested in some kind of formula. It's interested in this 6-day period and then a 7th-day Sabbath kind of thing. So there's something significant about that, which you will then see maybe when you go into the flood story again, where you see some kind of an interest in the cleanliness of or the sort of clean and unclean animals and sort of and those sorts of things. So this theory was then picked up by Herman Hapfield in 1853. And so what he said is actually there are two E sources, and he called one of the sources E1 and he called the other source E2. Now, as I mentioned, one of the E sources is very interested in ritual things. So it's interested in things like the Sabbath, it's interested in sacrifices, it's interested in ritual purity. It's interested in genealogies and numbers. So this source was later identified as a P source, or in other words, it was a priestly source. It takes into account the interests of the priestly class. So E1 was later referred to as the P source. So what you then have is, I need to correct that slide. What then you then have is that you now have 4 documents. So you have the J source that uses Yahweh when it talks about God. You have the E source that uses Elohim when it talks about God, and then you have a separate source, Deuteronomy, and then you also have running through the Pentateuch, you have the P source, the priestly source, the source that is interested in things that have to do with the priestly class, ritual purity, sacrifices, and so on. So that is kind of what is referred to now as the documentary hypothesis, where they say that the book of Genesis is a compilation of the writings from 4 different sources, and that's kind of a theory that's still very much accepted and respected in the field of biblical scholarship. So I think it'll be helpful for us to just have a look at some of the characteristics that are used to identify these 4 different sources. These are hypothetical sources, by the way. Now, what I will say is that this theory is quite a strong theory, and there was a period of time where there was kind of, people were starting to move away. Some scholars were starting to move away. Actually, not some, but a lot of scholars were trying to move away from this 4-source theory. And what happened was the people started looking a lot deeper into the sources of the Pentateuch, and some people were saying, well, we have to look at the genre of the sources. So there was something that's referred to as literary criticism, where you're looking at the genre, you're looking at when this thing was likely to have been written, and it went really, really far, so to the extent that they would take a manuscript and they would just break it down sort of word by word and try to see which source do we assign this to. Some I think I've read somewhere that some people even went as far as breaking down the letters and go, well, in which source do we assign this letter to, and so on, and it just becomes kind of a minefield. And so what some scholars have started to do in recent times is they've started to make a case for the simplicity of the 4-source theory, where they're saying, well, let's just use Occam's razor. Let's just use the explanation that's easiest to understand and makes the most sense. And that's what we're going to go with. And then they therefore insist on this 4-source theory. And I think one of the scholars whose works I've read is Joel Baden, who is a new Hebrew Bible scholar at the University of Yale. He actually has part of his course that he delivers at Yale is on YouTube, called The Introduction to the Hebrew Bible. I think I'll put a link in the description of this video. And he's written this book called Renewing the Documentary Hypothesis. And he basically makes a point that why are we overcomplicating things? Let's just stick to an explanation that makes the most sense, that's easiest to understand. And let's stick with this four-source theory. And he gives lots of very good examples in his book. It's a brilliant book. It's not the cheapest to buy, but it is a good investment if you have an interest in deepening your knowledge on this. And he gives really, really good examples. And he also explains how he arrives at saying which source do you assign this story or this part of the story to. So that's basically the documentary hypothesis and where things stand today. So the characteristics of these four sources, very briefly. So the P source uses Elohim for the divine name in most cases. It has a very formulaic style of writing. And I'm just going to give an example from Genesis chapter 1. So in Genesis chapter 1, you have this formula. So you have God doing this, and then there was evening, and then there was morning, and then there was a first day, and then it breaks it up. So sort of you have these sequences of 3 days, and then you have another sequence of 3 days, and then you have the seventh day, which is a rest day. And this is, and it does a lot of formulaic stuff like that in its stories. P is also very interested in genealogies, and you can understand why priests would be interested in that, because obviously they would want to prove that why they are part of the priestly class and why they should be part of that ruling class. So there is a very deep interest in genealogies. Another thing I would just say is, if you think the story is quite heavy, and it's got all these details and numbers and all sorts of things like that, then that's likely going to come from the priestly source. P is also very interested in covenants. It's interested in cultic practices and the priesthood. The J source. So the J source, as we said, it uses Yahweh, the tetragrammaton, for the divine name. It's less formulaic than the priestly source. It is very much interested in ancestral promises of land and descendants, and it uses covenants to kind of establish these promises. And one other interesting thing that you will find in the J source is that God is very anthropomorphic in the J source. So again, I'll just use an example from the two creation accounts. So in the account in Genesis chapter 1, God takes this kind of standoffish approach to creation. So he just says, let there be light, let the land partition from the waters and so on. And he's just giving out these instructions and things are happening. In Genesis chapter 2, in the creation account in Genesis chapter 2, God takes on quite an interest in Adam and Eve. He actually forms Adam from the dust, and he takes the rib out of Adam. He forms Eve from the rib, and so on. He has these conversations, like one-to-one personal conversations in the garden with Adam. So that is a characteristic of J that you see throughout the Pentateuch, of God sort of coming down to the level of humans, sometimes even being seen by Moses, as you see, as we'll talk about later on. So God being very anthropomorphic. Hope I haven't butchered that word completely. The E source. So the E source uses Elohim for the divine name. It's less formulaic in the style of writing than P. It emphasizes a prophetic interpretation of Israel's origin, and Abraham is idealized as a prophet. One of the accounts that I referred to earlier, where one of the rulers wanted to take Sarah as their wife, and Abraham lied effectively about Sarah, saying Sarah was his sister instead of his wife. God reprimands this ruler and says, "Did you not know that this man was a prophet?" So Abraham is very much being cast in the light of a prophet in E. Now, the thing about J and E is that, especially as you go on further, if you go on towards the end of Genesis, you get into Exodus, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between J and E. And sometimes you have to break up a sentence to say this is assigned to J, this is assigned to E. So a lot of scholars, at some point, scholars just said this is the JE source, and they just left it there. They didn't bother sort of breaking them apart, and some scholars still follow that convention where they just say JE without bothering to sort of distinguish where J starts and ends, where E starts and ends, because it becomes very, very complicated and you can't apply Occam's razor to that. The D source. So the D source is confined to the literature in Deuteronomy. So basically, if you're talking about the D source, it's the D. But if you go on further into the books that are beyond Deuteronomy, there are some of these are referred to as the Deuteronomistic history. In other words, the whoever was responsible for the D source then went and wrote these other books beyond Deuteronomy because of the similar interests in them. And D consists of sermons and laws presented by Moses in a single day. Moses is effectively giving this speech. That's what Deuteronomy is all about. And it focuses on the covenant, the need for Israel to be distinct from surrounding nations, for the importance of centralized worship, and the dangers of idolatry. So in terms of the dating of the Pentateuch, so one might wonder, why is it so important to kind of date the Pentateuch? And this is kind of important for biblical scholars, because when you establish approximately when this was written, you can kind of figure out what was happening when this was written and why this message was being sent out. Now, the earliest theories that were presented when the scholars were trying to date the Pentateuch was that P was the earliest source. And one of the reasons they say that was the earliest story is in Genesis chapter 1, the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, which is from the P source. So it's kind of like a foundational history, and then other stories are then layered on top of these. But Julius Wilhelmsen, a German scholar, 19th century, he lived in the 19th and the 20th century, he actually said the opposite. He said that P was the latest source. And the reason he said that is, I think when you assume that P was the earliest source, you have this idea where there was centralized worship, and then this worship got corrupted, and in Deuteronomy you have this polemic against this corruption of worship, and then order is restored. But Wilhelmsen said actually the opposite happened. Actually, initially there was this decentralized kind of worship, and then D came in, and D tried to fight that, and that's why there's this strong polemic against this decentralized type of worship. And by the time P came in, all that order that D wanted had been restored, and so P just assumes that that's the way things have been all along. And so in P there is really no conflict as such when they're writing. So well, according to Wellhausen, J and D were sort of written around the beginning of the monarchic period in Israel. And then D, as we've mentioned, was written in the late monarchic period, but some say as late as the reign of Josiah, or sometime just earlier than that. And then P was pretty much the latest source, and there is even a strong argument that this was probably written after the exile in Babylon, when Israel was no longer a kingdom with a king, but it was now a theocracy, and the priests were essentially the ruling class, and then they've written that and superimposed it on the rest of the Pentateuch. And I think that's kind of a good theory. So I've got some references in the slides there. As I said, I'll put a link to these slides in the description so that you can have a look at them if you are interested in kind of looking at the material that I used to put these slides together. So the thing I will say is, I think it's a very important question as to who actually wrote the Pentateuch. And if you were going to ask me, I would say the Pentateuch was definitely not written by Moses. And as I've discussed in this presentation, I think there is very, very good reasons to say that Moses actually did not write the Pentateuch, and as we'll see later on as we explore the book of Genesis, this becomes very, very evident. But hopefully this overview has been helpful for anyone who wants to delve into the world of Bible scholarship. I do have a hope that at some point I will be able to bring on some Bible scholars to discuss these subjects with me, or I will actually, hopefully I can even bring on people who are not actual Bible scholars, but they have an expert or very good knowledge of some of the topics that we're discussing around these themes. My channel is a very small channel, so it's very complicated to bring a Bible scholar, and especially one that's maybe reputable, onto a small channel like this. But hopefully, if the channel grows and gains more traction, that will become a possibility. I also have an idea of, if people have questions, maybe people can submit those questions, and if they're relevant to the topic, and depending on the length of the topic, the length of the video, I will try and make it possible for some of those questions to be addressed as part of the project. So I hope you found this interesting and informative. If you haven't already done so, please don't forget to like or to subscribe to this video. And I will hope to see you again next time for another episode of the unHoly Bible Project. That will be episode 2. And in episode 2, I will be talking about the 2 creation accounts in the book of Genesis. So I hope to see you all then. And until next time, it's goodbye from me.
But you can't do that, said one of the critics.
That doesn't bother me.
Really? Again? Really?
Look at that little enemy of God.
Somehow we dilly and dally, takes us years, and we wonder why.
What are you waiting for?